Steve, 'tis the season to lie to our kids.
Mm-hmm.
So
From one perspective, yeah.
In not all traditions, but if you are someone that celebrates Christmas, like I don't believe in God, but I celebrate Christmas because it's fun.
It's cultural, it's traditional.
It's a very much a family oriented holiday, but there is a tradition that happens here where we teach our children, and you and I did teach our children that Santa Claus exists.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a overarching question about, how to handle truth with children, how to deal with truth telling and everything. So, but here's the basic scenario. So we tell our kids at a young age, oh, Santa Claus, and we get into the details, and they see Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer on TV,
Mm-hmm.
and they buy into the whole cultural thing, and all their friends at school believe and everything. And right around 8,
mm-hmm.
right? It's a good
5 to 8 is the peak, or 4 to 8 is the peak fantasy belief ages.
Yeah, but I'm just saying, like, right around 8 years old, so
Yeah.
not uncommon for kids to get savvy enough where they're like, is this real?
Yeah, the reality testing kicks in, like, this doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. So what I promised myself was that if either of my kid asked me if Santa's real, I say, no, he's not real. I tell him the truth, right?
Mm-hmm.
So my son, Dylan, who is 11 years old, is super smart. And he figured it out very early, and he asked me, and I told him the truth, and my wife got really mad at me, right? So right now, we are currently lying to my 8-year-old daughter.
Mm-hmm.
She asked if Santa was real, and the decision was made that we are not going to tell her. We're going to let it go another year, all for their enjoyment.
Yeah.
So my first question to you is there anything...
Are you a bad parent?
Yeah, is there anything negative about this idea?
So I could tell you from, like, again, my own experience, what I think, but I could start by telling you what the research shows and what the experts think. So first of all, just the phenomenon of believing in Santa Claus is not harmful.
Mm-hmm.
It is completely natural and normal for young children to have a fantasy life.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't distinguish as well between fantasy and reality. That sort of kicks in a little bit later. So it's developmentally appropriate, as we would say, to have an imaginary friend, to believe in these kind of fantasy scenarios. It is, do they really, really believe it? Do they really, it's hard to say. But so I think to some level, depending on the age that they do, but that's also a kind of a range. Belief is kind of a different phenomenon if you're a kid that age. It's not so much that they're thinking, yes, I'm distinguishing reality from fantasy, and this is reality. They're just not distinguishing. To them, it's all just fantasy. There's actually a very healthy aspect to it. So having these kind of fantasies like Santa Claus is good for the imagination.
Mm-hmm.
It helps with socialization. It helps with problem solving, with critical thinking. There's actually a lot of cognitive developmental benefits to engaging in a rich fantasy, life, a rich fantasy world when you're age appropriate, when you're at that age.
Yeah.
So just belief in Santa Claus is not a problem. The other question you might ask is, what about when kids are told that Santa's not real?
Mm-hmm.
Actually, it's not traumatic, and this has been studied as well. So it's not a traumatic experience for kids to find out that Santa Claus is not real. In fact, most kids experience that as a very positive experience. When they get to the age where they ask, if they're old enough to ask the question, they're old enough to hear the answer.
Yeah.
And if they're told that Santa's not real, or if they learn that Santa's not real, they usually are proud of themselves. They feel empowered. They understand that they're getting older, and they actually have a positive experience. And there doesn't appear to be any negative or traumatic experience from just learning that Santa's not real.
Mm-hmm.
So all things considered, the belief in Santa when you're at the appropriate age, and then later learning that Santa's not real, is fine. It's natural. It's healthy. It's probably a good thing.
Yeah.
Right. You brought up, though, another question, and that is, what do you do as a parent?
Yeah.
And there's a range of things that you can do. I'll tell you what the child psychologist recommends, psychiatrist, and what the evidence shows is that you shouldn't straight up lie to your kids. Right? First of all, you don't have to, and you should not do that.
Mm-hmm.
Like for me, I never told my kids that Santa Claus existed. I never lied to them ever about that.
You didn't need to. It just happened.
Didn't have to. You don't have to. It's in the culture. It's infused. They watched Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. I never affirmed or denied the reality of anything to do with that. I just let them believe what they believe.
Yeah, but did you write on the presents from Santa or from mommy and daddy?
So we always wrote on the presents a combination of things, from mommy and daddy, from Santa.
From
Then
the doctor?
when we started watching Doctor Who as a family, and the kids were very young and they were still in the fantasy, stage, some of the presents were from the doctor, because they kind of all knew it was with a wink and a nod, and these are fantasy things and we're
Mhm.
having fun, and they knew that we got the presents.
Yeah,
There was really, I don't think, any ever doubt there about that, and that was just all part of sort of blurring the lines. But we never straight up said, that Santa exists or anything, and they never really had to ask. They just sort of, at some age, they knew.
Yeah.
They just knew that Santa wasn't real, because they figure it out. Because you get old, once you get to the certain point where you have enough reality testing, critical thinking going on, it's such a blatant non-truth. I mean,
yes.
I'm sorry, he delivers presents all over the world in one night and with flying reindeer. It's a clear magical thinking.
Yep.
Like, it's just at some point, yeah, of course it's not true.
I mean, when my son asked me and I told him the truth,
He knew it.
He knew it, and he was confirming it with me, and there was almost a little bit of relief. He's like,
because it becomes increasingly out of step with reality.
Yeah.
Right. It becomes increasingly difficult to maintain belief in Santa Claus, and at some point they have to let it go.
Yeah.
And then there is a relief. They feel good about it once they let it go, and that's also not a bad experience to have.
Mm-hmm.
And we've spoken about this on the Skeptics Guide before, about the fact that, well, what is the experience that these kids are having? So the broader culture has this belief in a magical man, and at some point they realize that it doesn't make sense. It's all magical thinking. It's not real, and that just because the broader culture believes something doesn't mean it's reality.
Mm-hmm.
So they learn a lot of important critical thinking lessons through the experience of shedding that belief in Santa Claus.
Now, this is a good concept when you expand it out into a person's life as they get older, because you and I had lots of these types of reality check moments, like religion,
UFOs, a lot of paranormal stuff like ESP and stuff. And we were younger, so that's like the next phase. That's like the preteen teenager phase for us, where we were very interested in science and we consumed a lot of popular science, and that was infused with a lot of popular pseudoscience. And the media, the general culture, and the media that we were consuming made no distinction between the two. So we would watch, National Geographic and In Search Of, and whatever. We would watch different science programs, some of which were legit and real, some of which were legit mostly, but would throw in some mystery mongering, and some were pure pseudoscience. And we didn't really have the scientific chops at the time to distinguish between them. They were all just fascinating ideas. It's like there were dinosaurs 65 million years ago, and aliens occasionally land on the earth. Like, these were like equal claims to us, right? But then we started to learn science and critical thinking, and we started to apply that, and also start to get exposed for the first time to scientists and science communicators expressing skepticism about, like, the first time I heard like Carl Sagan say, yeah, there's no evidence that UFOs exist. I'm like, really? Well, I have to take that seriously because Carl Sagan is saying it, but really? And then, you start to explain, like, you're right, there isn't. And then, it also tickles something like the Santa Claus thing, right? When you confirm it for your son, he knew kind of in the back of his head, this can't be real. It just doesn't sit well with reality. I think we had the same experience where we're like, we knew that the evidence for alien visitation or Bigfoot or whatever, these phenomenon was always like, it was always blobsquatch. It was always right on the edge. There was never anything confirmatory, nothing. It was always a suggestion and inference as,
there's no material objects.
There was never anything, no smoking gun. And that was okay, because I never saw a dinosaur either. You know what I mean? Like, there's lots of things that we never saw a black hole. And a lot of things that we accept because some scientist says there's evidence that we can infer that this exists. But then when you start to realize how science works, at some point, like, that the whole UFO thing, if you're also waiting for the other shoe to drop, like you're waiting for the government to say, yep, here's the alien body, or whatever, like for the evidence to come out. And after a certain amount of time, again, it just doesn't sit well with you. And then finally saying, yeah, you know what? this is all bullshit. None of this is true. It is a relief and it is empowering. You're like, oh, that's right. Not everything that people say is true is true.
Yeah,
And we can just stop believing in this nonsense.
And
And now the whole world realigns itself, you know?
it's remarkable that some people never have any of those
Yeah.
intellectual awakenings. I think this is a failure of the school systems globally and
General broader culture.
yeah, but at its core,
Yeah.
we're talking about becoming closer to reality,
Yeah.
understanding
It's
that
all reality testing and critical thinking. Just
Exactly.
at different levels, different appropriate educational levels, neurological developmental levels, etc. Yeah, so the whole Santa Claus thing, we love Christmas. Again, we're not Christians, anymore. We were raised,
Yeah.
Catholic, but
I still relate to the whole thing.
yeah. So, but we're agnostic, atheists. We don't hold to any supernatural belief. But culturally, traditionally, it's about family. It's about being together
love
with the people.
Christmas.
Yeah, love
It's
it.
wonderful.
It is, yeah, and so we can enjoy it for all of that, and then the whole mythology of Santa Claus and whatever associated with it, just part of the fun and the magical sort of
Mhm.
again background of it all, and that's all fine. It's all fine,
But
but you
ju-
don't have to. I do want to emphasize you don't have to lie to your kids to get the magic. The magic is there.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
That's true. I mean, I guess in the end, it really doesn't matter from what the science
At the end of the
shows.
day, it doesn't really matter.
It doesn't matter if your
Yeah.
kid, if you want your kids, you want to engage with that,
But if you feel uncomfortable lying to your kids, then don't.
yeah,
And what I do when my kids asked me, I just threw it back at them and said, "Well, what do you think?
Yeah.
Does Santa Claus exist? Oh, what do you think?" Which I do generally, right? So if you when kids ask, "Well, why is the sky blue?" Or like one time I remember my daughter asked me, "What color were dinosaurs?" I'm like, "That's a great question."
let's
So
figure it out. Yeah.
how could we know what color
Mhm.
dinosaurs? What do you think? What would be the information that we can? And we sort of worked through together, like what kinds of information could allow us to infer like what colors dinosaurs might have been. But so it's the same thing. It's like does Santa Claus exist? Well, what do you think? And by the time they're old enough to ask that question, they're usually
Right.
old enough to say, "Well, it seems how does he get around the world so fast?" Yeah, I know it's kind of interesting, right? It doesn't really make sense. And then you just sort of engage with them with the conversation. You don't have to ever
Yeah.
break the illusion
Build
for
their
them.
skepticism
Yeah, you
chops
build
up by
the-
making them question things.
Exactly. Just turn it into a
Now-
conversation, reflect all the questions back at them, and it's great. It's a great experience.
There is an angle to this whole thing that adds a lot of complexity. So my
Mhm.
son Dylan also has caught me a couple of times telling people white lies.
Hmm.
Now, white lies, very briefly, the white lies are basically built into most cultures, right?
Yeah.
There's certain things that you just don't tell people the absolute utmost truth all the time. Like especially you're out shopping and the person's behind the cash register wants your email address. And you can either say, "No, I don't want to give that to you," which you might detect might have a little tinge of rudeness,
Yeah.
or you just come up with some other reason, right? Well,
Mhm.
one of these things happened. I ended up telling a white lie, and my son get in the car, and he's like, he questioned me,
Yeah.
and I had this huge shift in my head, like, oh wow, like I've really got to think about,
Yeah. You
like,
got to think about it more carefully.
yeah, I got to be careful what I say, because even though it's socially accepted, that's a hard thing to explain to an 11-year-old.
But there's a difference, I think, in how much people are comfortable with white lies. And you could also decide that just to be more honest,
Yeah.
and just take the social hit a little bit.
Yeah.
Like just saying, I prefer not to give out my email address. Like that's you can say that.
And I think there's a lot of alternatives to
Yeah.
not white lying. But like a perfect example. Now I don't.
just
work-
it's an easy way out, and you may have to work a little bit harder, but yeah, but I think that could
Let
be.
me give you a scenario
Yeah.
that
All
hit me
right.
a lot.
All
Okay, like working with people and going out to lunch with a friend at work, and somebody else wanted to go, but you know that you and the other person don't want that third person to
Yeah.
join. What the hell do you do? So you could either tell them a white lie,
Mhm.
or you have to actually go somewhere that is almost inappropriate to go to with a coworker, right?
Yeah.
But that's a good example, I think, of these constructs that we have to
Yeah.
deal with in the adult world, and white lies. I was just watched a TED talk of a person who is a lie expert,
Yeah.
and she was talking about white lies, and she wasn't saying, she's like, everybody tells white
Yeah,
lies. Like
yeah.
it's part of human interaction.
Right.
There's something mammalian about it. It's just the way that we interact.
Well, because we're very social creatures,
Yeah.
and we're always looking out for our perception, the way we are perceived by other people, and our relationships with other people. And it's basically Because you're right. Imagine going through your day. There's a movie about this, right?
Yes,
You're
that's
going through
right.
your day telling 100% unvarnished truth. It'd be socially impossible. Like you
Yeah,
couldn't do
it'd
it.
be too much.
But it's just a matter of how masterful you are at it. Like, you could try and how much effort you're willing to make at it. Like there's white lie, and then there's choosing which truth you choose to tell.
Mhm.
Like giving people, like there's a difference between lying and not being fully candid with
Yeah.
somebody. Like you can withhold information from them, give them the information that enough to achieve your goal without lying, but without telling them maybe the more unvarnished
Yeah, like
information. Although I found myself in a situation where I've done that,
Mhm.
where I've given somebody a partial answer and they don't buy it.
Oh,
They're
okay.
like, that's not a good enough answer. I want to know the real reason.
Yeah.
But I don't want to tell them the real reason because it's none of their damn business or whatever. Right? I may be protecting them. I may be protecting myself. I may be protecting a third party.
Yeah.
It's just not my thing to tell.
Yeah.
It's
yeah.
not for me to tell you. I'm keeping a confidence of somebody else. And you don't want to say, well, it's a secret, because then that blows the secret.
You're giving information.
The fact that it's a secret is information. Yeah. So sometimes you have no choice. Which brings up a whole different layer of when you ask somebody to keep a secret for you, you're basically asking them to lie for you.
In a sense, yeah.
And that's a big ask.
It is a big ask.
And we don't necessarily always consider that we're now putting them in a situation where, and something that I've told people, don't ask me to lie for you. I'm not going to do it. So if you don't want, in a certain situation, obviously like my wife and I, people understand there's a spousal confidence, and
Yeah.
I don't think people have any problem with that. So yeah, I keep my wife's confidence, she keeps mine, and that's fine. But then if you go outside of that a little bit, it's like, don't wrap me into your deception. Like,
Yeah, of course,
I don't
of
want to
course.
be involved with that. So just either don't tell me or just don't expect me to keep that secret. But it's tricky. It is tricky. There's 1,000 variations of that. And it's interesting.
But getting back to the complexity of like having to teach children that, it is very difficult.
It's very difficult.
And I thought one of the books that my daughter was reading, she doesn't read it anymore, but it handled this whole thing.
Yeah.
And it was pretty interesting. So the basic point was, and the example that they gave was, kid makes a drawing, the girl doesn't like it. She tells him, I don't like the drawing, and I don't lie anymore. And she tells the kid, I don't like the drawing, and the kid gets very upset.
Yeah.
So a teacher tells the little girl, you didn't have to tell him that you didn't like the drawing. You could have said, well, I really like the color purple in the drawing that you did.
Yeah.
You could
choose the truth.
You could choose. Yes,
yeah.
exactly. And I thought that was a good way you put it. Like, you choose the truth. So you could share something that you feel that is acceptable without telling them the bigger lie.
Another way to think about this is that we are not computers, right? We are psychological beings. And there are different ways to convey the truth to people. You can't just think of it in terms of, well, the facts were accurate, because you could lie with facts, right?
Absolutely.
And not only can you lie with facts, you can tell the truth with partial facts, right? So in other words, like when you're giving feedback to somebody, you can frame it in different ways. You can frame it in a constructive way. You can frame it in a less constructive way. And sometimes just being brutally honest is actually not going to achieve the end of honesty.
Yeah, that's
because now what you're doing is creating the wrong impression in that person because of the way you framed the information that you were giving them. But if you gave them the same information but framed it in a different way, or maybe with other information that was not necessarily completely necessary, but helps frame it up. Like, I really like your use of color here. Maybe you could think about your construction a little bit,
exactly,
or whatever. That's saying I don't like it. Maybe true, but it's not getting you anywhere. It's not really accomplishing your goal. So it does get very complicated.
Like another example would be, if you have children and you watch them do sports, my kids have varying degrees of ability to do sports, right? So like my daughter was learning cheerleading and trying to do a cartwheel, and she was like one of the last girls in her class to get it. And instead of saying, obviously you're not going to be like, oh, that looks terrible, whatever. Like, everything was a moment of encouragement.
You're really working hard.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I could see that you're trying so hard. I mean, you just got to lift your legs up a little more, and you try to frame things in a positive way, especially for children, because they need that positivity and that reinforcement. But moving into the adult world, this is a very difficult thing.
Just big children.
This
we have all the same insecurities, Steve, and everything.
You're dealing with an adult, and they're asking you for feedback. How was it? How did I do?
So
You know,
yeah, I know. And there's no, I'm not, obviously, this is a huge topic that we're
yeah,
not going to be able to cover here, but a couple of things to throw out there. One is sometimes I will ask people, how brutally honest do you want me to be? Of course, you're already giving them information just
yeah.
by
Of
asking
course
that
you are.
question, because that you're saying there's a brutal reality that I have that I'm holding on to. But if I know somebody well enough, it's like,
Can they take it?
yeah, what are you looking for here? It sounds like you could even jokingly say, are you looking for affirmation, or do you really want the brutal truth? And if it's somebody you know well enough, but that frames it as well. Now you're like, they're giving you permission to give
Yeah, of
them
course. I
the
mean, when I
unvarnished
ask
truth.
you after we do an event,
Yeah,
I always like want to know what you really thought.
you want to feel good, but you do need to know what I
Yeah, but
really think.
I want to get better,
Yeah,
and I wouldn't, and
yeah.
I got to be honest, like, if you weren't giving me the hard feedback that I needed, I wouldn't have been making the progress that I have been making,
Yeah.
and
But it's hard but constructive. So
yeah.
again, I'm not saying you're terrible at this.
No, not at
That
all. No,
doesn't accomplish
but you need the
anything.
truth though. Like the
It's
truth is a
yeah,
tool, right? Like if you think about it, it's
yeah.
so important and it's so delicate. And it's a very difficult tool to give people because
So what is the truth? Let's bring back to Santa so we can wrap
yeah.
this up. I had a friend of mine in high school. A very nice person, little neurodivergent, if you want to use that term, but she's a very nice person who even at like 18 years old said, I know Santa's not real, but I still believe in him, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
That's how they framed it for themselves. And that's kind of, I think, the same approach. Like, whether or not he's actually real is not the point. Whether or not you believe he's real or not is not the point either. Santa is about the holiday, about
The feeling.
the feeling,
Yeah.
about the culture, about the tradition, about the mythology, about the storytelling. And you just keep it in that realm.
Yeah.
If you just keep it in that realm of fantasy, and it's fine.
Mm-hmm.
And it's healthy. It's all part of being human. And you just don't take it into the realm of reality. And that's a good approach with kids. You just always keep it in that realm of fantasy and mythology. And if they start to ask you specific questions, you just sort of reflect it back and don't answer it, because it's not something you can answer in the realm.
Yeah.
And it's also, of course he doesn't exist. And when they're old enough to appreciate that, they'll figure it out on their own. And that's really all you have to do about it.
All right.
All right.
There it is, guys.
But have a Merry Christmas, everyone.